Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this research seminar from the Center for Social Concerns on what's new in the new encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And we want to, again, thank you all for joining us on this Friday. See many familiar faces, see some good CST minors out there, as well as a number of friends of the Center for Social Concerns. I just wanted to start out, since the encyclical is very much about solidarity, I'm just going to start with a short prayer on solidarity. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, empower your one human family to join hands on our journey of faith. Send us your spirit of hope so that we may work to alleviate human suffering and foster charity and justice in our world. Amen. Again, thank you all for joining us. I'm excited to have this discussion this morning. So again, as many of you know, that on October 4th, which was the feast of St. Francis, the Pope Francis then released his new social encyclical. And within that, he wanted us to look at, he speaks of ways that we're called to live together. And how do we, again, and he calls for us to live a new culture of solidarity. So this morning we have 4 speakers for you. The first person that will speak will be Margie Pfeil, who has a joint appointment at the Center for Social Concerns, also within theology. And she will speak on the style of the encyclical and then particular issues like capital punishment and nonviolence. Our next second speaker after Margie Pfeil will be Dan Graff. Dan is the director of the Higgins Labor Center here at within the labor studies right here within the Center for Social Concerns. And that Higgins Labor Program, not only does he do that, but he's a joint appointment also with the center with the history department. He will speak on the economy, history, and ways that we can concretize the message of fraternity in terms of the labor question. The third person will be Grace Munene. Grace is the Assistant Director for the International Summer Service Learning Program, and she will speak on rethinking the human family with a focus on migration and renewed encounter. And then last but not least, our fourth speaker will be Dr. Clemens Sedmak. Clemens will speak on, he is the Catholic Social Tradition Advisor at the Center for Social Concerns, as well as the Interim Director at the Nanovic Institute. So, and he will speak on integral human development. So again, it will be Margie, Dr. Pfeil, and then Dr. Graff, Grace Munene, and then Clemens Sedmak. So I'm going to turn things over to Margie to kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Bill. It's wonderful to be here this morning with all of you and to take up this exciting encyclical together. I'll just offer a brief overview and highlight some of the things that stood out to me in relation to earlier texts, both by Pope Francis and other popes. His audience, he's writing from a Christian perspective to invite into dialogue all people of goodwill, to foster a culture of encounter rooted in social friendship. And one of the things I noticed immediately was the wide range of interlocutors reflecting ecumenical, interfaith, classical, artistic, and literary strands. So from Virgil and Cicero through Aristotle to Irenaeus to the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayeb, and then through to Wim Wenders, who directed the film, one of the documentaries about Pope Francis, a man of his word. And I think this reflects one new feature that I notice in this text. Francis cites his own addresses most of all, and even journalistic accounts of his own papacy, like the Wenders film, as well as the Spadaro and Reyes Alcaide publications. And more than any previous encyclical, he uses this text to sum up his overarching view articulated over the course of his papacy. He indicates he means it as a sort of roadmap. For the last few years, many theologians and practitioners have hoped that he would write an encyclical on nonviolence, especially after his 2017 World Day of Peace message on that topic, as well as a series of conferences and research working group efforts that he sponsored, of which I was a member. The word nonviolence, though, does not appear in this encyclical. As an aside, the word violence appears 40 times. So instead, Pope Francis is using many of the pieces of his earlier works to flesh out the meaning of social friendship in our times. If, as the 2017 World Day of Peace message described, the Beatitudes are a kind of field manual for nonviolence, this text incorporates the spirituality of the Beatitudes to offer a vision of its implications. So what can it look like in practice, I think, is the question that this text is putting forward. And it offers an answer. It looks like the Good Samaritan, and it's all the more necessary in this time of the pandemic. COVID-19 has exposed the inability of people to work together in spite of hyperconnectivity, he says in paragraph 7. Quote, the pain, uncertainty, and fear, and the realization of our own limitations brought on by the pandemic have only made it all the more urgent that we rethink our styles of life, our relationships, the organization of our societies, and above all, the meaning of our existence. If everything is connected, it is hard to imagine that this global disaster is unrelated to our way of approaching reality, our claim to be absolute masters of our own lives and all that exists, unquote. That's from 33 to 34. So one of the key features of social friendship is the preferential action for the poor. And I would commend you to read paragraph 234 in particular. He's emphasizing, as he did in Laudato Si', the throwaway culture that extends to people as well as the rest of creation. And he puts special emphasis on the elderly, disabled, unborn, and most vulnerable. And he says he insists throughout the text. I count at least 10 different places where he says this. Building social friendship must begin with the least. And this is where the Good Samaritan comes in. He sees the Good Samaritan as a model of social friendship. And I'd just like to read a bit here from paragraph 67. Quote, the parable eloquently presents the basic decision we need to make in order to rebuild our wounded world. In the face of so much pain and suffering, our only course is to imitate the Good Samaritan. Any other decision would make us either one of the robbers or one of those who walked by without showing compassion for the sufferings of the man on the roadside. The parable shows us a community can be rebuilt by men and women who identify with the vulnerability of others, who reject the creation of a society of exclusion and act instead as neighbors, lifting up and rehabilitating the fallen for the sake of the common good. At the same time, it warns us about the attitude of those who think only of themselves and fail to shoulder the inevitable responsibilities of life as it is, unquote. So one of the key pieces of this vision of social friendship is his emphasis on peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. One interesting note is in our own times, restorative justice is a prominent feature here in the United States. Within the work of the Bishops' Conference, this has really gained traction, as well as in the broader society. And he almost articulates restorative justice explicitly in 3 different places. I am curious why he didn't go further, particularly in relation to the very strong emphasis on the abolition of capital punishment that he has put forward in his papacy and that he emphasizes here in this document right around paragraphs 263 forward. In that context, he's also addressing the mass incarceration, life sentences in prison, and extrajudicial executions in a very explicit way in 266 to 268. And another thread that he's following through in terms of peace and reconciliation is his insistence on nuclear disarmament. This has been a key feature of his papacy, and he picks that up here again. So in the face of the many instances of violence around the world, he's insisting on a culture of encounter as the antidote. And again, I think the Good Samaritan is his model for that. And he says, for Christians, this takes root in the gospel, but this vision of social friendship is meant for the whole world. And it's not only rooted in Christianity. This is why he's appealing to all people of goodwill, and he sees dialogue as the way forward through this culture of encounter, and to create and instantiate the culture of encounter evermore. So in interreligious terms, he sees interreligious dialogue as an expression of social friendship. And in that context, he speaks about conscience and religious freedom. So strands through his papacy, but also previous popes, especially John Paul II and Benedict XVI. It's also ecumenically oriented, the dialogue that he envisions. So one last thing about this, he also speaks about the proper role of church in relation to politics in paragraph 276. And his treatment there reminds me of Oscar Romero's understanding, which essentially said the church does participate in politics. It's not partisan, but rather rooted in the meaning of the word polis, taking responsibility for the common good. So a couple of things just here at the end that I would say I noticed are missing and that I might have expected to see. First of all the models of fraternal love at the end of the document are that are offered as witnesses of nonviolence, peace, and reconciliation are male. So St. Francis, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Gandhi, Brother Charles, wonderful people. Even though the text clearly asserts the equal dignity and rights of women, still somehow women are missing here at the end in terms of witness. That is surprising to me. As you all know, in his 2015 address to Congress, Dorothy Day was included there. And for a document that urges historical consciousness, I think that omission is especially noticeable. I also would have expected to see some mention of the sex abuse crisis. What does this message of social friendship mean within an institutional church that is still struggling to make the systemic changes needed to prevent the sort of egregious violations of human dignity that it decries? This seems to be a missed opportunity, and perhaps one more sign of the challenge of naming systemic sin when we were caught up in the structures that perpetuate it. The text does offer ground for taking this step using the language of co-responsibility. Almost at the end, I'm aware of my time, so bear with me. This is from paragraph 77. Each day offers a new opportunity, a new possibility. We should not expect everything from those who govern us, for that would be childish. We have the space we need for co-responsibility in creating and putting into place new processes and changes. Let us take an active part in renewing and supporting our troubled societies. Today, we have a great opportunity to express our innate sense of fraternity, to be good Samaritans who bear the pain of others' troubles, rather than fomenting greater hatred and resentment. Unquote. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan can be applied to the church itself in relation to the sex abuse crisis. The call to co-responsibility flows from our baptismal commitment to discipleship of Jesus, using the charisms gifted to each of us by the Holy Spirit at baptism. So in our time here in this place, overall, I think this is a much needed message, and I receive it gratefully as a word of hope and consolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Margie Pfeil, for, again, those great insights into the document. Now we're going to turn things over to Dr. Dan Graff.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, friends, and hello, strangers. I'm humbled and honored to be on this panel. I've learned a lot over the last 5 years from colleagues at the Center for Social Concerns on Catholic social teaching. So I'm eager to participate in this discussion. As I was writing this letter, Pope Francis remarks in the introduction to his latest encyclical, the COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly erupted, exposing our false securities. This passage struck me, for the remark will always be in there, forever connecting this document to the coronavirus crisis, which continues to shape and scar us and shed light on the fault lines of privilege and power marking our society. It seems particularly fitting because the Pope here expresses such deep concern to reassert the importance, more than that, really the necessity of connecting the local, the indigenous, the immediate, the visceral, and the historical to what he hopes will be, quote, the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity, unquote. In characteristically powerful prose, the Pope argues, quote, let us dream then, as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home, each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all, unquote. The charge given us commentators this morning is to answer the question, what's new in Fratelli Tutti? But I think my fellow panelists are better equipped to answer that question. The provincial American in me, first hearing the term Fratelli Tutti, immediately thought of Little Richard, not Pope Francis. To me, I'll admit, this encyclical seems less to chart new ground than to consolidate and re-articulate the Pope's thinking on a plethora of issues. Perhaps less important than the newness of the ideas, however, is the novelty of the moment of their reception, when we need more than ever the concepts and practices called for here: friendship, solidarity, hospitality, humility, respect, subsidiarity, openness, and adventurousness. Now, one of the hallmarks of the Catholic social tradition is its insistence on relationality, the interconnectedness of everyone and everything, with a corresponding refusal to consider individuals outside of the contexts, familial, economic, cultural, national, within which we all operate and interact. It's an assertion of inherent human dignity that flies in the face of neoliberal thinking, which tends to reduce all behavior and meaning to that which can be individualized, isolated, measured, numbered, marketed, and commodified. That insistence on those human connections animates this encyclical. And for me, I'm especially drawn to its sections on the economy, as the Pope rejects systems where, quote, parts of the human family, unquote, the poor, the disabled, the elderly, can be readily sacrificed to give others what he calls a carefree existence. As he bluntly sums it up, quote, some economic rules have proved effective for growth, but not for integral human development, unquote. This document, in short, reaffirms in resounding rhetoric the Pope's longstanding critique of our global capitalist economy. More strikingly, in the same section, he laments that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, quote, solemnly proclaimed 70 years ago, unquote, has not been realized. For, again, in his words, in practice, human rights are not equal for all. The persistence of poverty, racism, human trafficking, modern slavery, and sexism, the Pope concludes, all reflect the resurgence of mindsets that treat people as objects, as means to ends, as labor costs on a balance sheet, rather than as sisters and brothers deserving of respect, dignity, equality, and opportunity. I realize that Pope Francis might direct attention to the Catholic Church itself on some of these issues, and that the gendered language of this very encyclical's title suggests problems on this front. But at the same time, it's refreshing to witness here an economic critique of unadulterated capitalism explicitly integrated with calls for gender equality and racial justice. In other words, Catholic social tradition has always drawn interconnections, but perhaps now it's recognizing intersectionality. In urging us to, quote, recover the shared passion to create a community of belonging and solidarity worthy of our time, unquote, the Pope repeatedly uses travel metaphors, referring to the roads, bridges, and pathways that connect us. And it's very clear that he prefers the old-fashioned brick and mortar infrastructure to digital wizardry. He deploys the parable of the Good Samaritan which he says is, quote, constantly being repeated as great numbers of the marginalized get stranded on the roadside of our globalizing economy. Most of all, he decries that so many of us act as what he calls indifferent bystanders, averting our gaze from those wounded and excluded, yet standing in plain sight on the side of the busy routes that we walk each day. I really appreciate the redeployment of the Good Samaritan parable here, especially as the Pope embeds that story within his critique of a global order that produces increasing inequality of wealth, unceasing disruption of traditional economies, active discouragement of taking responsibility for the costs and casualties of that order, and a general acquiescence among much of the populace. But not allowing us to point fingers at others, Pope Francis cautions, quote, all of us have in ourselves something of the wounded man, something of the robber, something of the passersby, and something of the Good Samaritan. The challenge, as always, is how to translate an encyclical into action. To continue along this metaphor of travel, here the Pope takes us on a journey through history, economics, geography, and values, walking with us, cajoling us, inspiring us, and then pointing us toward a path that we need to forge ourselves. He writes of roadmaps throughout, but he doesn't really provide us one, and nor should he. A believer not only in the dignity of every person, but also the agency of the people, he calls on us to get together in social friendship, in a parish, in a community coalition, in political life, at the United Nations, to enact solidarity. He warns us against remaining or becoming what he calls secret allies of the robbers from the parable, those, quote, detached and impartial critics who live off that system and its benefits, unquote. The signs and the allies are everywhere, he says, if only we will look. To start, we need to meet the gaze of the wounded on the roadside, the essential worker at the grocery store, and the organizer protesting for racial justice. Then, once the gaze is met, we can begin the unending process of becoming brothers and sisters all. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dan. Now we're going to turn to Grace Munene.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to my fellow panelists and also for the audience that has joined us this morning. I am going to focus on rethinking the human family with a focus on migration and also on renewed encounter with a focus on forgiveness and reconciliation. So to start, I do remember reading the previous encyclical Laudato Si a few years ago, where Pope Francis focused on our relationship with creation and our common home. This new encyclical can be seen as building up from the previous one, as now he's asking us to rethink how we relate with each other as human beings in this shared home. To be able to rethink the Catholic social teaching principles in a practical way, or rather as a way of life and not abstract concepts, as a way of being. I have to admit, when I started reading the encyclical, the first few pages, they paint a very gloomy picture of our world today. But then that's the reality, that's the world that we are currently living in. A lot of dysfunction of the human family has been exposed by recent events in the world today, with the pandemic, with the fight for racial equity, violent clashes between nations, and so many more. One could be tempted to think about moving maybe to a different planet, but then again, we would be carrying all our dysfunction with us to this new place. So the best way forward is for us to get down to work and to be able to rethink what kind of future do we want for ourselves and our children and future generations. In the preceding pages of the encyclical, the Pope proceeds to offer us a sense of hope through various suggestions on how we can work towards living together as members of the human family, each created in the image of God and deserving of the dignity that we each have received as a loving gift from God. So on the first issue of migration and immigration, in most cases, when we hear about these words, we think about people who are moving from faraway places coming into our communities, or even ourselves moving from our communities to faraway places. But the one thing that I was reflecting on as I was reading is how he asks us to open our hearts to people who are different from us. So it could be about looking at the borders and the boundaries we have around our hearts that prevent us from moving beyond our family members and getting to know people in our community, in our neighborhoods, and nationally, and then to be able to move globally, to be able to form authentic relationship with other people who are different from us. And through this opening of our hearts is how we are able to rethink new perspectives and new ways of relating with each other. As the Pope points out, we are all different and we have something that we can learn from one another. So with this opening of our hearts, this is what translates to the actions of hospitality, which we express when we encounter people who have moved from their communities and countries and faraway places. Since we have grown by developing relationship with other people within our community, now we have a better understanding of how we can relate with other people who seem even more new to us or different to us. And on the issue of thinking about people who have moved, either ourselves or other people who have moved, perhaps we should be seeking to understand why people are moving and maybe ask ourselves questions such as, what role have I or my community played or not in hindering the dignified development of other people in their in their lands of origin such that they have to move? And with the understanding that any suffering or problem that is happening in one part of the world will end up affecting the entire planet. So as we seek to develop these authentic human relationships, we're developing values that we carry with us into society as we're building institutions. And by institutions, I mean not just the government, but also thinking about the church and the schools. He does ask or pose a question about why the church took so long to be able to speak out about injustices in the past and continues to do so. So perhaps by opening our hearts and being able to encounter people in our local area and build up from there into the global community, then we can be able to relate better as members of the human, as members of the human family. Then on the second issue, on the issue of renewed encounter, as we're thinking about looking into the future with a focus on forgiveness and reconciliation, the Pope he proposes to seek truth and justice to past events. This is important in order to honor the memory of victims and to create a way to a shared hope. For example, truth means telling families torn apart by pain what happened to their missing relatives. We can never move forward without remembering the past. We do not progress without an honest and unclouded memory. And for those of us who are Christians, we do know that forgiveness and reconciliation are central themes in Christianity, as well as in other religions. And what we mean by forgiveness does not entail allowing oppressors to keep trampling on their own dignity and that of others. It means stripping them of power that they do not know how to use and that diminishes their own humanity and that of others. Those who suffer injustice have to defend their own rights and those of their family. They must preserve the dignity that they have received as a loving gift from God. So in essence, through this letter, the Pope is calling us to love. And like our previous panelists have mentioned, the parable of the Good Samaritan is what he has used to illustrate this kind of love that he's asking of us. To pause and ask our questions whether we'll be the ones who are taking away opportunities and resources and amassing them for ourselves, or whether we'll be the ones who walk away or turn our gaze from those who are in crisis. Or are we going to be the ones who reach out and demonstrate love to those who are in pain? And as I conclude, one of the people that he mentions as having inspired him to write this letter is Desmond Tutu. Tutu is a South African Anglican cleric and theologian. And I would like to end with this quote. So he says, if an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality, end of quote. So I appreciate this discussion this morning. I think this is the dialogue that the Pope is calling us to be able to continue to rethink about how to live together in this planet, because we are still here and our future generations are also counting on us. So I look forward to the continuing dialogue and listening to other perspectives this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Again, thanks for talking us through on rethinking the human family. Now we will turn to Clemens Sedmak, who will speak to us on integral human development.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us here. Thank you to Margie, Dan, and Grace for your words of wisdom. My contribution is entitled Overcoming Indifference, Fratelli Tutti, Integral Human Development, and the Center for Social Concerns. I have 3 points. Overcoming indifference will be the first one, integral human development the second, and social friendship the third, and then I have a brief conclusion. So overcoming indifference. On October 16th, 2017, that's about 3 years ago, on the occasion of the celebration of World Food Day, Pope Francis paid a visit to the FAO headquarters in Rome. Death by starvation or the abandonment of one's own land is everyday news, which risks being met with indifference, he said to the major UN organization dedicated to ending hunger and providing food security globally. We cannot resign ourselves to saying, someone else will take care of it, the Pope continued. Therefore, I ask myself, and I ask you this question: is it too much to consider introducing into the language of international cooperation the category of love, understood as gratuitousness, equal treatment, solidarity, the culture of giving, fraternity, mercy? In other words, the Pope asked about the integration of deep concerns as an antidote to indifference. The culture of indifference, though predicated on passivity, is a formidable opponent, compatible with serenity and politeness, high levels of personal comfort and the ultimate value of convenience. Indifference authorizes a self-protecting withdrawal from others in their need. It promotes a kind of shabby Gnosticism, according to which the knowledge and expertise of elites serves conveniently to harden them to the pain of others. In his new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis continues to denounce, quote, a cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference, section 30, which he also calls cruel in section 72. In this regard, Fratelli Tutti can be read as an extension and elaboration of Laudato Si's condemnation of the globalization of indifference as a widespread indifference to suffering and a nonchalant resignation. In the concluding prayer of the text, Pope Francis even uses the term the sin of indifference, the sin of indifference. Secondly, integral human development. Fratelli Tutti makes important claims about integral human development. Integral human development is a concept developed in the 1967 Encyclical Popularum Progressio. Pope Paul VI characterizes authentic development as the development of each person and of the whole person. Integral human development, then, is committed to leaving no one behind, to serve the common good, to respect the dignity of each human person, and to be concerned with the flourishing of each person. In other words, integral human development is the response to indifference. Or again, indifference is a major obstacle to integral human development. The new encyclical talks both directly and indirectly about integral human development. Let me mention 5 specific claims. 1, economic growth is not the same as integral human development. We have observed growth that has resulted in increasing inequalities, even new forms of poverty. And Dan has alluded to that. Second, there is a right and an obligation to integral human development. In section 107, he says, every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally. And in section 118, he says, we have an obligation to ensure that every person lives with dignity and has sufficient opportunities for his or her integral development. So there is a right and obligation to integral human development. Third, integral human development is incompatible with what he calls the light-hearted superficiality that we have cultivated. IHD is incompatible with the light-hearted superficiality that we have cultivated. 4, probably the most challenging aspect, integral human development is based on the recognition that the world exists for everyone, section 118. This limits any absolute right to private property. Quoting Pope John Paul II, Francis declares that the principle of the common use of created goods is the first principle of the whole ethical and social order, the principle of the common use of created goods. This limits any absolute right to private property, section 120. And 5, the deepest expression of a commitment to integral human development is the cultivation of friendships beyond borders. In Pope Francis's words, the cultivation of a love capable of transcending borders is the basis of what in every city and country can be called social friendship. Love moves us beyond ourselves and also beyond our small circles, sections 88 and 89. Love impels us towards universal communion. So my third and final section, social friendship. Let us elaborate a little bit on social friendship as the basis of integral human development. Social friendship means we care about each other. The question, where is your brother? Where is your sister? Is valid. People matter. A key message of the document is a reminder of the social nature of the human person. We only achieve who we are by our interactions with others. The good of the human person is a relational good. Pope Francis asks us to reimagine ourselves as a single human family. Quote, we need to think of ourselves more and more as a single family dwelling in a common home. However, we are largely indifferent to the lives around us. Even the tragedy of the worldwide pandemic, that is such a strong reminder of global interconnectedness, could not change that. We live in cultures of indifference. This can be seen as a crucial mission of the Center for Social Concerns, overcoming a culture of indifference. Fratelli Tutti urges, as Grace pointed out, a renewed and global commitment to love and solidarity as an antidote to indifference and as a means to advance integral human development. Solidarity finds concrete expression in service, whereby individuals learn to set aside their own wishes and desires, their pursuit of power before the concrete gaze of those who are most vulnerable. Dan alluded to that as well. Solidarity means much more than engaging in occasional acts of generosity. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. It also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work. This reads like a description of the mission of the Center for Social Concerns. Fratelli Tutti sheds greater light on the meaning of integral human development, as we have seen. Integral human development, far from an endorsement of the regnant global technocratic paradigm, the inadequacy of which has been laid bare by the pandemic, becomes the expression of a global solidarity that does not allow for cool, comfortable, and globalized indifference. My brief conclusion. During the above-mentioned visit to the FAO in October 2017, Pope Francis donated a marble sculpture to the organization. And let me just try to share my screen here. Maybe you've seen that. Oops, here it goes. Maybe you've seen that. The statue depicts the tragic death of Alan Kurdi, also known as Aylan, a 3-year-old Syrian boy whose body washed up on the shore of Turkey in September 2015 after a small boat holding a dozen refugees had capsized. Next to Aylan, we find a childlike angel weeping over the boy's lifeless body. We see the lifeless boy and the suffering and helpless angel who could not prevent the tragic death of Aylan. This statue is, by the way, placed near the main meeting room of the FAO, so when they have one of their meetings, they have to pass by this statue. Fratelli Tutti reminds us of the fact that we share one world with our brothers and sisters. Aylan is our brother. We cannot be indifferent to the story of our brother or sister. We are called to social friendship. Pope Francis' new encyclical is actually more of an apostolic exhortation to see ourselves inhabiting a world of one human family. We are invited to see that a love capable of transcending borders is the basis of what in every city and country can be called social friendship. Let those with ears to hear take heart. and that the Center for Social Concerns be a megaphone for this message in a deaf world. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemens, for again outlining that about the overcoming indifference, integral human development, the social friendship, but especially the image at the end, which is very powerful, kind of brings it all together. What I like now is to open it up for questions for folks on, if you click on the participants on the bar, you'll see on the left-hand side, you can raise your hand. There's a little blue hand. If you click on that to raise a hand for a question, if for some reason you have difficulty, just unmute yourself. Again, you'll need to unmute yourself and then let us know that you need to ask a question if you're having trouble to find it virtually. So again, we're just going to open it up for any questions that folks may have.
Chris, go ahead. I see your hand raised.
I couldn't find the icon, so I decided to raise my hand the old-fashioned way.
Thanks, Chris.
I wanted to ask a question about an initiative that I've heard about in the University of Notre Dame's College of Arts and Letters founding a Center for Race. And I was wondering if the Center for Social Concerns is involved with that effort and how this recent encyclical can speak to that initiative.
That's a question for Dan.
Thanks, Chris. The yet to be announced Center on Race that you referred to should be coming very, very soon. I think sometime in the next few months, the announcement will be made. I've been honored to serve on the committee drafting the proposal for this new center. And I believe that I was asked to serve on this committee, not just as a historian who writes and teaches about race in the US past, but also because of my role at the center. So the Center on Race is really interested in connecting closely with the CSC. So I envision lots of collaboration, and at the center of the Center on Race's mission is not simply research and teaching, but also community engagement. And I think the center's leadership, that is the Center on Race's leadership, will look to the CSC as a model in that regard. So yeah, so I'm very, very excited about this new Center on Race, and keep your eyes peeled for the announcement coming soon from Dean Sarah Mustillo. But I think there's lots and lots of potential to for Notre Dame to sort of launch from its Catholic identity and mission a real concern for confronting racism and thinking of ways to make the sort of the call here in this encyclical real in multiple realms. So thanks, Chris. I didn't pay Chris Temple to ask that question, but I'm grateful that he did.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, Chris Temple, for asking that. I know Robbie Kiley has a question. And then after Robbie, we'll have Tom Perkel. So Robbie, if you want to
Hey, yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Hey, great. Let's say that you're teaching a class, I don't know, in an hour or so, on the consistent ethic of life, and especially political engagement and things like that. Margie, I really appreciate it. I'll be the first to admit I haven't done all my homework, and I'm only about on paragraph 200. But just kind of wondering what new things that you hear and hear from Pope Francis about engagement in civil life, and what that looks like, and how we can, especially what's new here, and what social friendship has to offer within that political realm, especially.
Margie, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. Good to see you also. on that specific topic, Robbie, I think that what we see is a deepening of what he has said before. So if we start with the consistent ethic of life, I mentioned the emphasis on the preferential option for the poor and the connection that he made back to Laudato Si around the throwaway culture, applying not only to things, but to people. And he's talking about the most vulnerable people that in a way that really reflects that understanding of the consistent ethic of life from unborn life through natural death, emphasizing particularly in the context of the pandemic, the precarity of the lives of people dealing with disabilities and the lives of the elderly. He talks about elderly people being abandoned and being treated as if they're expendable in the context of the pandemic in particular. So those would be things for our times that it's not new, but there's a special emphasis. And he, I think as my friends on the panel have all emphasized in various ways, what he's hoping to cultivate is a sensibility to what social friendship actually means as a lived reality rooted in love, that it is not an abstract idea. It's something like the Good Samaritan that we have an opportunity to practice every moment where we find ourselves. And what does it look like right where we are? And I think there's an urgency there for our times that I don't know if I would say it's new, but it's especially catered for our circumstances, I would say. And Robbie, one last piece about the consistent ethic of life, I think, would be his reiteration once again about the importance of working for abolition of capital punishment. But then I think a new piece is his connection to the incarceration system and its practices as death dealing. So he explicitly, again, as he has before, decried sentences of life in prison. So I hope that helps. I don't know if there's more, Robbie, that you'd like to say.
No, I mean, thank you. That's I mean, really great, and I appreciate. If nothing else, the urgency in which we're in as well, and that Good Samaritan model is so. I love the extended reflection on that, and it's certainly something to bring in. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Margie, and thanks, Robbie, for the question. We'll go to Tom Purekel, and then follow that, we're going to have Emily Seipel-Swettler. So Tom, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks to the panelists. This was fantastic. I guess I'm hearing much of, I think, what Margie said about the fact that this builds off previous language around calling for interreligious dialogue that's come from Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict before him, and some of the other encyclicals that have come out, and so it kind of coalesces many of these messages. So I've got two questions. So one is what is new about this encyclical, or is it new more in the fact that it is pulling together some of these messages and putting it out and in a hopefully more compelling way? So that's my first question. My second question is, how are you different circles across the kind of the spectrum within the church are receiving this message so far? So over.
Clemens and Margie, maybe we want to on the.
Yeah, I maybe try to answer that. So Tom, when I read the encyclical, I did not have the same experience I had when I read Evangelii Gaudium or Laudato Si. These were coherent, powerful documents with a newness that I found striking. This is not the case in this text. I think, as Dan said, it's more the novelty of the moment than what we find in the text. I mean, I think you have to dig quite deep to find something that is new. And there are, of course, many nuances, but this idea of, fraternity and overcoming indifference and social friendship and love as a political category, he has said it on numerous occasions. And that's why I tied it back to the FAO visit in 2017. So I think the point of the encyclical is not so much I want to surprise you by saying something new, but I want to say something important in the crisis moment that we find ourselves in. And then there will be a lot of work. And you know, Margie, Grace, and Dan talked about that, translating that into practice. What does fraternity, you know, in a non-sexist way mean in our political structures and institutions? So that's my answer to your first question. And the second one about the church and the reception. I have not followed, obviously, all the receptions, but I did not see a fierce criticism. And I think that has to do with the seemingly harmless message that he has. I think that the strongest moment is his curbing of private property. And I found, you know, one or two articles that were critical about that. Is he taking away this idea of private property? Is he going more to the, you know, left-wing side? But other than that, I think given the generality of the message, and who can be against love? I mean, who can be against friendship? With some, I mean, very few exceptions, you know, on the side of libertarians, I would say, I have not seen, you know, negative responses.
Thanks, Clemens. Margie, do you want to say any other?
Oh, just about the piece about private property, you know, he is drawing on the whole tradition of the church. And so it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction at this point that every time a pope reasserts the universal destination of created goods and says that private property is conditional and limited, there's an accusation of Marxism that comes. And if you look at the Acts of the Apostles and what Jesus was saying, and then go back even further to the Genesis creation narrative, where that universal destination of created goods is rooted, it's very clear. And so, yeah, I guess we could say that Jesus was socialist, but I don't know where that gets us. It's anachronistic to say the least, but I think that emphasizing it again is a sign of the urgency of our times that he sees. Yeah, Tom, you know, as I said at the beginning, he's drawing a lot of the encyclical consists of long quotations from Pope Francis's own previous publications, and so he's not pretending to offer something brand new, but I think he's inviting maybe a new lens of contemplation in our time to say, look, people, we are in a pandemic, and perhaps this is of our own making, and that without really digging deep into social friendship, it's going to be much worse, and this is just going to keep happening. So that sense, as Clemens said, of exhortation, of urgency, is maybe the new piece.
Thanks, Margie and Clemens, for those insights, and thanks, Tom, for the question. Emily Sipos Butler, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Bill. My question was also about reception. Actually, I'm going to spin it a little bit differently. At the center this week, at Center for Spirituality at St. Mary's, we hosted a panel on the reception of Laudato Si 5 years past, and that raised a lot of interesting questions about how documents in general are received by the audience. But I'm thinking in particular about this one. You mentioned urgency a lot has come up, and I'm wondering, since there isn't a whole lot explicitly new in here, this sense of urgency, could this be, I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this is related exclusively to or primarily due to our current climate with the pandemic, or is this also something that may be related to challenges to reception of previous encyclicals, given ecclesial structures, given political climates? I'm thinking particularly about the US, that's just what I'm more familiar with, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I guess I
can. Grace, Margie, go ahead. I'm sorry, Margie, go ahead.
I'll just say briefly, Emily, I think you're right on that. Partly he's concerned about the actual context of the pandemic and then the climate crisis, but by citing himself so often, and especially the citation of the Wim Wenders documentary really called my attention, because it's clear to me that he's wanting to reassert what he's already said, and he's doubling down. For those who might not have received his earlier teachings, he's reiterating that and insisting and saying, look, this is what the parable of the Good Samaritan means. In my context as Pope, it means reasserting these basic claims about human rights and duties and human dignity, especially focused on the most vulnerable life, which includes all of creation.
Yeah, I would, if I could just make a quick response, would agree with Margie, but also think that an immediate context is political polarization and what the Pope calls the rise of, populist, in his view, negative populist, nationalist, xenophobic movements in the US and throughout Europe and elsewhere. So it seems, that seems really striking. I thought the extended discussion of populism versus the people was really important to him to convey.
I agree with both Dan and Margie. I think it's in response to the pandemic and our current environment, just because it has exposed the fragmentation of our world and the systems that we've had in place, like they don't seem to be working. So it's calling us to rethink about how to respond to the current climate moving forward. And also because the pandemic has also made us to sort of isolate ourselves. I mean, we are isolated. Countries are shutting their doors to other people, communities shutting doors to other people, and yet life is about interaction. So I think it's about responding to the context that we are in and the experiences that we are having right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie, Dan, and Grace for the response. Thanks, Emily, for the question. Any last question? What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of the speakers just to say just a quick closing word or two, and we'll close with prayer. So maybe we'll do in the same order. We'll go Margie, then Dan, then Grace, then Clemens. Margie, any last words?
Just thanks so much for this conversation, and to my friends on the panel. I really appreciated hearing from you, especially. And the last image, Clemens, that we used, I was picturing that image outside the door of the Center for Social Concerns, and I wonder if that's possible.
Dan?
Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity and for people joining us this morning. I just think, again, the insistence on the historical and the interconnected runs deep in Catholic social tradition, and this is reasserted here, and sort of not separating the economic from the cultural, the political, and the climate crises is critical here. So,
thanks, Dan. Grace?
I think for me, it's to have a sense of hope, like we cannot lose hope despite everything that is going on, just to keep moving forward and pushing forward for the change that we're looking for. So I feel a call to hope, like we just have to continue hoping for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. And in closing, Clemens?
I think Fratelli Tutti could be really the basis for the mission statement of the Center for Social Concerns as we develop it. And I just want to say I have a very personal relationship to the statue of Aileen Kurdi, because as most of you know, we lost our son in the summer. And I don't think that he would have died, had we lived in the kind of world that Pope Francis describes and exhorts us to build in Fratelli Tutti. And we had a very similar scene in the backyard on the day when that happened, when my wife was sitting to the lifeless body of our son. So it's powerful, and it speaks to me about this, overcoming indifference. And there are so many ways to do that. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for that. And when closing, I'll close with prayer and to say, Also remind folks to go to the Center for Social Concerns website, and you can get more information on different resources on Catholic social thought, and especially around things with the election. But I especially want to thank Clemens Sedmak, Dan Graff, Grace Munene, and Margie Pfeil for, again, sharing their wisdom and making us all better for that. And in closing, let us say, Lord of wisdom, awaken us to our duty to care for the basic needs of all people. Strengthen with hope people denied their human rights and freedoms. Provide us all with the voice to cry out for justice for the poor and the oppressed. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend. Thank you for joining the Center for Social Concerns. Our next event will be in November with Carrie Alice Robinson will join us as a keynote speaker. So hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dan, can you hit the stop record?